Lee Kuan Yew never used the word collapse lightly. When he warned of it, he did not mean tanks in the streets or institutions suddenly failing. He meant something far quieter and far more difficult to reverse: the collapse of relevance, discipline, and competitive position in a world that no longer waits for comfortable societies to catch up. If he were to warn that Australia's collapse is inevitable, he would not be predicting chaos. He would be describing a trajectory that, unless interrupted, leads to a steady loss of capability masked by continued wealth and social calm. In Lee's thinking, collapse is not an event. It is a process. It begins when a society mistakes past success for future security. Australia, he would argue, is especially vulnerable to this mistake because nearly every signal it receives suggests reassurance. Living standards remain high. Institutions function. The country is peaceful, admired, and protected by distance and alliances. These conditions create a dangerous illusion that adaptation is optional. Lee believed that large, resource-rich democracies often decline precisely because they feel safe. Safety weakens urgency. Urgency is the engine of reform. Without it, systems evolve to preserve comfort rather than sharpen performance. Over time, incentives reward distribution over productivity, consensus over execution, and stability over transformation. None of these choices is irrational in isolation. Together, they produce inevitability. Australia's economy, in Lee's view, sits at the center of this dynamic. Resource extraction has delivered extraordinary wealth with relatively modest institutional strain. When income flows easily, productivity becomes a secondary concern. Efficiency is tolerated rather than demanded. Innovation is encouraged rhetorically, but not enforced structurally. The result is an economy that grows in size without growing in capability. Lee was obsessed with per capita performance because it reveals truth without illusion. Aggregate growth can hide stagnation. Population growth can inflate GDP. Commodity cycles can mask inefficiency. Per capita productivity strips these effects away. On that measure, Australia's trajectory would alarm him. Growth persists, but competitiveness erodes. The gap widens quietly. He would argue that Australia's political economy reinforces this erosion. Revenue from resources funds social stability. Social stability reinforces political caution. Political caution resists disruption. Disruption is precisely what a competitive world demands. When disruption is delayed long enough, it arrives externally and violently, not internally and deliberately. Lee would be unsparing about political incentives. Democracies, he argued, are excellent at reflecting voter preference and poor at enforcing long-term necessity. In Australia, leaders proposing deep reform face immediate backlash. Leaders preserving the status quo are rewarded. Over time, governance shifts from preventing decline to managing it. Management feels responsible, prevention feels risky. This pattern extends to education and skills. Australia produces many graduates, but too few dense clusters of world-class capability. Universities are numerous, but uneven in global impact. Research exists, but commercialization lags. Talent is trained, but not systematically concentrated into ecosystems capable of competing at the highest level. Lee believed density matters more than volume. Australia's scale and distance work against density. The consequence is talent leakage. The most ambitious individuals seek larger markets, faster ecosystems, and greater opportunity elsewhere. This is not betrayal. It is rational choice. But rational choices aggregate into national weakness. Over time, innovation slows, entrepreneurship thins, and domestic ambition softens. Lee would also point to labor and regulation as accelerants of collapse. Australia's protections provide security, but they also reduce adaptability. Firms hesitate to restructure. Industries linger past relevance. Capital becomes cautious rather than bold. In Lee's framework, adaptability is survival. Systems that cannot adapt voluntarily eventually adapt under duress. Another pillar of inevitability, in his view, is strategic complacency. Australia assumes that alliances will compensate for economic and technological underperformance. Lee respected alliances, but he warned that they are strongest when partners are indispensable. Indispensability comes from capability, not sentiment. Values earn goodwill, capability earns leverage. Australia's strategic posture, he would argue, risks outsourcing long-term thinking. Security is assumed, markets are assumed, stability is assumed. Assumptions delay preparation. When the external environment hardens, adjustment becomes expensive and politically painful. Lee would also highlight Australia's demographic and geographic paradox. A vast country with a relatively small population concentrated in a few cities. Infrastructure costs are high. Internal integration is expensive. Regional development lags. Scale without density is inefficient. Singapore turned density into advantage. Australia's scale dilutes it. He would insist that none of this means Australia is poor, unstable, or immoral. Collapse, in his warning, is relative. Others will move faster. Capital will find better returns elsewhere. Innovation will concentrate in denser ecosystems. Influence will shrink. Australia will remain rich, but less relevant. Less relevance means less leverage. Less leverage narrows choices. Over time, sovereignty becomes constrained not by force, but by dependency. The most dangerous element of inevitability, Lee would say, is perception. Australians still feel successful, and they are by many measures. That feeling delays urgency. By the time decline is felt broadly, through slower mobility, reduced opportunity, and constrained choices, the structural causes are deeply embedded. Lee often warned that late reform is always more painful than early reform. Early reform offends comfort. Late reform threatens stability. Societies that wait for pressure lose the option of gradual adjustment. He would also caution against the belief that collapse requires failure of values. Australia's values may remain intact, institutions may still function, elections will still be held. That is precisely why collapse is misunderstood. The system will work, just not well enough to keep pace. In Lee's vocabulary, inevitability does not mean fate. It means momentum. Momentum continues until countered by deliberate force. Australia's momentum, unless redirected, points toward relative decline because its incentives reward comfort over competitiveness. He would end his warning calmly. No drama, no accusation. He would simply observe that history does not punish countries for being unjust. It punishes them for being slow. Australia's collapse, as he would define it, is inevitable only if it continues to believe that success is self-sustaining. Collapse will not arrive with noise. It will arrive with confidence. And by the time that confidence fades, the cost of reversing course will be far higher than anyone expected. Lee Kuan Yew would continue his warning by insisting that inevitability is rarely recognized as such, while there is still time to change course. Societies almost always interpret early warning signs as temporary fluctuations rather than structural signals. In Australia's case, he would say, the warning signs are dismissed precisely because they do not feel threatening. Wages still arrive, supermarkets are full, institutions function, elections proceed peacefully. These signals create a sense that the system is healthy. Lee would argue that this is how decline hides in plain sight. He believed that the most dangerous phrase in national strategy is, we are still doing well. Doing well compared to yesterday is irrelevant if others are accelerating faster. Collapse, as he defined it, is not about absolute poverty or disorder. It is about falling behind in capability while assuming position will be preserved by habit, history, or goodwill. Australia's collapse, in his logic, would unfold through cumulative misalignment. Economic incentives reward rent-seeking over innovation. Political incentives reward consensus over execution. Social incentives reward comfort over ambition. None of these incentives are malicious. All of them are popular. Together, they form a system that resists change, even when change becomes necessary. Lee would focus again on productivity because it is the clearest long-term indicator. Productivity is not glamorous. It does not generate headlines. It does not win elections, but it determines whether a society can afford its ambitions. Australia's productivity slowdown, masked by commodity income and population growth, would be his primary alarm. He would say that when a country becomes wealthy without becoming more productive, it is living off structural luck. Luck, Lee insisted, is not a strategy. It expires without notice. He would also stress that Australia's political debate rarely centers on capability. It centers on distribution, who gets what share, how to protect existing arrangements. Distribution debates assume growth. When growth weakens, distribution becomes zero-sum. Zero-sum politics is corrosive. It intensifies division and paralyzes reform. In Lee's view, advanced democracies often collapse politically before they collapse economically, not through coups or revolutions, but through gridlock. Gridlock prevents adaptation. Adaptation delayed becomes crisis-driven. Crisis-driven reform is always more disruptive than planned reform. He would also warn that Australia's regulatory environment reflects past conditions rather than future needs. Regulations designed to protect workers and consumers in a slower, less competitive world now inhibit flexibility in a faster one. Firms become risk-averse. Capital avoids experimentation. Innovation shifts elsewhere. This does not produce immediate failure. It produces stagnation. Lee believes stagnation is more dangerous than recession. Recessions provoke action. Stagnation numbs urgency. Another dimension of collapse, in his analysis, would be strategic irrelevance. Australia assumes its strategic importance is permanent because of geography and alliances. Lee would argue that strategic relevance must be renewed continuously. Allies prioritize partners who add value. Value is measured in capability, not sentiment. If Australia's economic and technological base erodes relative to peers, its leverage within alliances declines. Decisions are made elsewhere. Consultation becomes symbolic. Influence fades quietly. Sovereignty, in practical terms, becomes constrained. Lee would emphasize that this process does not require hostility from allies. It happens naturally. Systems optimize for effectiveness. Sentiment does not override necessity. He would also caution that national identity becomes brittle during this phase. When external relevance declines, societies often turn inward. Identity debates intensify. Nostalgia replaces strategy. Past achievements are invoked to justify present inaction. Lee believed nostalgia is a warning sign. It signals that a society is looking backward for validation instead of forward for direction. Australia's collapse, as he would define it, would therefore be psychological as much as material. Confidence would persist longer than capability. By the time confidence cracks, reversal is difficult. He would also highlight generational impact. Younger Australians face higher barriers to housing, slower mobility, and greater competition for opportunity. When younger generations perceive the system as closed or stagnant, social trust erodes. Erosion of trust undermines cohesion. Cohesion loss weakens governance. Lee believed cohesion is not sustained by rhetoric, but by opportunity. When opportunity narrows, cohesion frays. He would return again to leadership. Leadership, in his philosophy, exists to confront reality before it becomes unavoidable. Australia's leadership class, he would argue, is trapped by incentives that punish foresight. Proposing deep reform risks electoral loss. Preserving comfort ensures survival. Over time, leadership becomes managerial rather than strategic. Managerial leadership can maintain systems. It cannot transform them. Lee would insist that none of this is irreversible. Inevitability, in his vocabulary, describes momentum, not destiny. Momentum can be redirected, but only through deliberate force applied early. Once decline becomes visible, the cost of redirection rises sharply. He would warn that Australians misunderstand collapse because they associate it with disorder. In reality, advanced societies collapse into mediocrity first. They remain orderly, peaceful, and polite. They simply cease to matter proportionally. That, Lee would say, is the cruelest form of collapse. There is no moment of reckoning, no clear enemy, no single mistake to correct. Only a narrowing future shaped by decisions that once seemed reasonable. He would conclude by restating his central warning. Australia's collapse is inevitable only if it continues to believe that success will protect it from consequence. History does not punish countries for lacking virtue. It punishes them for failing to adapt. If Australia does not rediscover urgency without crisis, discipline without fear, and ambition without illusion, then collapse, as Lee defines it, will not arrive with violence or chaos. It will arrive quietly, comfortably, and with full confidence that it was never going to happen at all. Collapse will not arrive with noise. It will arrive with confidence. And by the time that confidence fades, the cost of reversing course will be far higher than anyone expected.